Hi, at Choose To Think, we kick off each month with a 5-minute collection of ideas and recommendations from our recent curiosity diet. I have Harish with me here today. So, our first recommendation is from the world of books. It's a book called Genius, The Life and Science of Richard Feynman. It's by James Gleick, one of my favorite authors on science. So, the book is a detailed exploration of Richard Feynman, the legendary Nobel winning physicist, original thinker, dabbled in several things. So, one major takeaway that I had from the book is that Feynman is really famous for his irreverence, especially towards authority figures. And one of the influences potentially was his father, who told him to value curiosity over what he called uniforms, because his father was actually a uniform salesman and would actually say that uniforms don't matter so much. So be suspicious of jargon and outward appearances.
And how does this compare with surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman?
Correct. So that is a lot more intimate. And if you read this book, you realize that Feynman was very good, especially in later life, with myth making. So he could turn a small anecdote into a legend about himself. This is a lot more dense, detailed. It also gives you a huge historic perspective of what science was like at that time, because particle physics, nuclear physics, everything was exploding at that time. With that, let's get to your pick for article of the month.
One of the most insightful articles that I read was this HBR article by Linda Gratton. And the topic of the article is how to do hybrid right. And this has been the flavor of the month for us because we've also been helping companies figure out their back to work or back to hybrid kind of policy. Though it sounds like back to school, it is definitely not the same. People were working even when they were home. But that's important because we've actually been seeing people, managers, leaders think about different kinds of scenarios. And this article sums it up very nicely about how we should start with people and their human concerns and limitations before thinking of the institutional ones. And there are different roles which will require different kinds of work policies. So this I thought was a very detailed and very articulate way of looking at going hybrid and how people should think about it, especially leaders. And I think this in these times, it's a great article to pick from.
So Richard Feynman was also famous for his first principles thinking. I think a lot of people can use articles like these to reimagine and not just use hybrid as in Bhel Puri, but hybrid as in really designing something wonderful, which is to the best of all worlds. So with that, let's go to our book summary of the month. If you are ideating, what this book called Subtract by Leidy Klotz argues or recommends is that oftentimes when we try to solve a problem, we try to add more things to it. Instead, there is a lot of power, an underrated power in subtracting, in removing, in eliminating things. And this is not very natural to most of us. I think great designers, you can also think of the likes of Steve Jobs, who realized that instead of adding more buttons and more dials, you should actually just remove as much as you don't need. So this book actually talks about human behavior in this context of taking out. So Harish, from our book summary, let's go to our SmartCast of the.
One of the most inspiring smartcasts that we had in the recent past was with Ria Shroff Desai on how should founders think about building a culture for future relevance. Again, a lot of the topics that we spoke about were in the ballpark area that we usually play in. We spoke about codifying your culture. We spoke about rituals. We spoke about how to create a mythology. We spoke about Feynman and his mythology, how to create a mythology of a company through stories. And that is how different tribes have always come together. So there were a bunch of these things that we spoke about. The big takeaway for me was this concept of culture debt. And again, this was something which we spoke about with Monish Darda. We picked his podcast earlier as well for Insight Your Month. And he had also spoken about how when they started iCertis, they were very clear about what is the kind of organization they want to build before the product that they wanted to build. So she was also talking about how these third time, fourth time entrepreneurs understand the value and importance of culture debt and they don't want to rack it up because they don't want to later pay that interest. So that was quite fascinating. And I think a lot of interesting things and takeaways from that conversation.
Excellent. From human concerns, I think that you have something a little different for our podcast episode recommendation. What is it? And more importantly, how are you going to pronounce it?
So the podcast pick is an episode from 99% Invisible. This is a fantastic podcast. This guy called Roman Mars who does this show about how designers see things. 99% of it, which is invisible to the eye, we see only 1%, and we think this is how it is. And he actually talks about what is the backstory, what are the things working behind the scenes. So a lot of interesting episodes. The one that I've picked right now is Axolotl, which is supposed to be the model organism. Basically regenerates every part of its body. So it's a kind of a salamander. It was, I think, found in Mexico first. When the Europeans went there, they said, this is great. They took some of these organisms back to Europe. And then they realized that this is great for all kinds of biological laboratory work. And it would breed quite well in captivity. So all labs all over the world have this organism. And now over so many generations, the laboratory version has deviated a lot from the one in the wild. The interesting part is it is fairly available all over the world, and it is almost extinct because it's available only in Mexico in the wild. But I guess this is where we're going to draw that inspiration in terms of biomimicry that we want to take when it comes to regeneration. And that's, I think, probably the next holy grail for innovation and human civilization. So Axolotl is going to be a big source of inspiration for us.
All right. So with that, we've come almost to the end of this episode. But before we go, we have a tip on habits for all of you. We love our reading, and so do a bunch of other people in the world. And I'm sure the readers are always asked, how many books do you read in a span of time, like a year? How do you get through so many books? And one such person who's probably turned reading into an extreme form of sports is the economist Tyler Cowen, who reputedly gets through 3-4 books a day. And so he's talked about this in great detail in one of his podcasts. But the tip that we want to share is about how he reads so quickly. And what Tyler Cowen says is actually fairly actionable, as well as something that gives us mere mortals something that we can do, which is that the philosophy of reading is not that people read quickly. He says that how long did it take you to read that book? The answer is 57 years at the time of the podcast, because that was his age at that point. So he says that you really read well by reading a lot, and you read a lot your whole life. And then at some point, you start saying, yeah, I've seen this here, I've seen this there, I don't need to know this now. And you then swiftly start going through these reading material. And that's really the way to read aloud. So there is actually a compounding return to being obsessed with reading throughout your life. So start as early as you can and don't stop. So that's the habit tip from Tyler Cowen, endorsed wholeheartedly by Choose To Thinq and Choose To Think Compound. So with that, we will bring this episode to a close. We'll see you next month. Thanks, Harish.
Thank you, Raman.